way to go. But I'll leave it there. I think I'm getting straying from your question. But my point is the automakers, they're not going to sell as many of the traditional cars as they think they will, because the model simply is not going to work for the future of China. They've got to rethink, and they've got to start thinking in different ways.
Thank you for you should be at the convention. Over here we have a new friend of mine, just in and taking our Masters in International Studies here at USF. And he has a question, a hard question for you. Please speak in the mic. Is it that way, guy?
It's on, but not.
It takes a few seconds.
Hello?
No,
Can you hear me?
this way.
Can you hear me?
Do this way.
After the switch is pushed, it takes a few seconds for it to click on. Is it not working?
You just yell. Would you like me to yell?
Yeah.
So I lived in Beijing from 2006 to 2011, and during the build-up to the Olympics, you kind of just stole my thunder. I was going to actually talk about the limits on purchasing vehicles. One of the limits, and you said that you're not allowed to limit the amount of cars you're allowed to buy a year, and I think each person is allowed to buy one car, and I might be wrong in this, every 10 years. In other words, they get to buy a license plate to put on their car, and they can't buy another license plate or essentially another car for another 10 years after that day. Do you think that benefits foreign cars in China, or do you think that benefits domestic production?
Well, for now, I think that benefits foreign cars, because if you're limited to just one car, and you have the impression, as most Chinese still do, that the foreign cars have better quality, then certainly you're going to lean toward that. I will say this, in Shanghai, which has a different model, the model in Shanghai is actually, they have people bid for license plates. So count on Shanghai to do it in a more market-oriented way, right? So they throw it open to bids, and you bid on license plates. Well, what this does, of course, it drives the price up. License plates are going for about $10,000 in Shanghai now. Well, if you're going to pay $10,000 for a license plate, are you going to buy a little $7,000 Chinese brand car to put it on? What it's essentially doing is it's driving sales of the big foreign cars in Shanghai, and it's killing the sales of the smaller Chinese branded cars. So unwittingly, the Chinese are sort of shooting themselves in the foot. Now, in this sense, though, Shanghai Auto, which is the local big automaker, actually kind of benefits because their partners are General Motors and Volkswagen, and they sell lots of those. They have their own brands. One is called Roway, and one is called MG, which they bought MG Rover from the UK. And so they now have their own brands. So these are, even though they got the plans from a foreign company, they now have Chinese brands. And they actually, some of the Roways are decent looking cars. The 550, I think, is a nice looking car. And the quality is getting better. I was at the Beijing Auto Show in April. And I had been at Shanghai Auto Show in 2009, and you could get up close and look at cars and see little nicks in the finish. You could see like the seam between the door and the front fender would get wider toward the bottom. Just a lot of lack of detail to fit and finish. I didn't see any of that in Beijing Auto Show this year. So quality's getting better. They're closing that gap, but it's still coming from what they're able to learn from foreign automakers. And my sense is that Chinese auto is very much, it's become so heavily dependent on copying what they learn from the foreign automakers that one day, as the gap gets closer to being closed, they're not going to be able to see beyond that, because the incentives for the state-owned automakers simply aren't in place to push them to be innovators. So I guess in a roundabout way, what I've said is this does hurt the foreign automakers. I mean, this does favor the foreign automakers, and it hurts the Chinese brands, I think, without question. And that goes against one of the major goals for the industry, is to boost Chinese brands.
Stand up, face the audience, and ask your question. Loud.
three parts to my question. First of all, I don't know how the Chinese government collects taxes. Can you tell me how they tax the auto industry? Second part is the infrastructure question. Is the Chinese government prepared to build more roads? Is there going to be a destination? And the repair problem. There are no repair shops. These taxi cabs that you talk about, they have 1 year life. They're turned back to the plant. The third part was the driving times. People that can afford the cars, that work in the center of the city. I basically recollected one person ordered a chauffeur because it was taking him 2.5 hours to drive 3 miles to his job. And then there was the question of parking, the privileges that are given at that. And the third part is the energy crisis. The price of fuel is going to go up. We know that. And it's always going to go up. And so those are my 3 parts.
Here's a question back here after you answer those 3 short questions with short answers.
Okay, first on taxes. There are sales taxes on automobiles. There's a 10% sales tax. And then the companies themselves are taxed on their profits, of course, as corporations. On infrastructure, during the previous 5-year plan, China spent 1 trillion renminbi on roads. So they've got another 62,000 miles of expressways planned under the current 5-year plan. And China tends to execute on these parts of their 5-year plan when it comes to building infrastructure because the money flows and they build it. So in terms of China's freeway system, their expressways will sometime soon, if it hasn't already, will be longer than the US freeway system. So they're quickly putting in place this infrastructure. In terms of the driving times, that sort of gets into the congestion part that I was talking about. There's simply nothing that can be done about it under the current model. You can't build any more roads in Beijing. In central Beijing, they've got all the roads they're going to have unless they want to go and start tearing down buildings and putting roads in their place. But if the buildings aren't there, then why go? So I think, and Beijing has really wide roads. I mean, amazingly wide roads that you can't cross them on the surface. You have to go underneath to get across. Like Jianguomen wide, just massively wide. So, and these are stuffed full of cars. So there's just really nowhere else to put them. And it makes sense that Beijing is limiting them. So there was one more, I think.
Well, the fuel prices,
the fuel.
energy prices.
Well, one thing that happens in China is the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, which is China's economic planner, controls the price of gasoline at the pump. So they can raise it or lower it, and it's well below market cost. So it is being, in a sense, subsidized by the state. This is another aspect of this that stands in the way of quality for Chinese cars. The 3 major auto companies in China are so powerful that in and of themselves almost have ministry-like status. They're that powerful. They're being told, on the one hand by NDRC, this is the max you can charge for gasoline. They're being told by the ministry, the Environmental Protection Ministry, you need to make low sulfur fuel because the emissions equipment in cars require a lower sulfur fuel. But the oil companies are saying it costs more money to make that kind of fuel, but you won't let us charge more. Therefore, we're not going to make it. And they can get away with that because they're that powerful. And so this is one thing that stands between China's establishing higher standards for emissions that would cut down on emissions a bit, but also in terms of quality standard for being able to put the kind of equipment in their cars that could be sold overseas according to a European or a North American standard. They could put that equipment in, but with the high sulfur fuel, it would damage the equipment.
Sure.
Your book is very timely because just a few weeks ago, James Fallows published his latest book on what the Chinese government is planning to do with the airline industry, very similar to what they're doing with the auto industry. Did you hear the question?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I guess my question is the government doing the same developmental plan for both of these industries, or are there significant differences? And then I also wanted to know a second question. In terms of the export model for Chinese cars, I understand a Chinese company has purchased Volvo, is that correct? And if that is correct, what was the thinking behind that? And one last question. I was surprised by the large proportion of market share going to foreign brands. And traditionally, countries, to protect their infant industries, usually slap big tariffs to encourage the infant industries. China did not follow that at all. Thank you.
Okay. These are three really great questions. The first one, though, I haven't read James Fallows' book yet, and so I'm not sure what's in there in terms of plans for the airline industry. So my guess is it would be very different, though, because airline is primarily, it's a service industry. Now, does he get into the airlines or aircraft manufacturing? Aircraft manufacturing.
Aircraft manufacturing.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, that's a bit different. There's probably some similarities, but I don't know enough about the aircraft manufacturing business to know. I know the first big jet that they're coming out with looks almost exactly like an Airbus A320. And there happens to be a factory in, I believe, Tianjin, where they're assembling Airbus A320s. So that could have a connection there. Let's see, your second question? Volvo, yes.
Volvo.
Yes, Volvo was bought by a company called Geely, which is a private automaker in China. But it actually wasn't bought by the company that makes cars. It was bought by a holding company called Geely Holdings, owned by a man named Li Shufu. He's an entrepreneur in China. And so in his empire, he's got Geely, which is a Chinese-branded auto group, and then he's got Volvo, which is the Swedish auto company. And so the two companies are not related. When part of buying Volvo, it was owned by Ford before. Ford had bought a bunch of luxury brands back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then gradually spun them all off. Part of the holdup in buying Volvo from Ford was very concerned about its intellectual property, because the two companies, Ford and Volvo, had become intertwined, sharing platforms and so forth. And they didn't want that intellectual property to find its way into Geely. And so Li Shufu had to make this promise. Volvo is Volvo, Geely is Geely. Well, the interesting thing is the NDRC came along and said, oh, we have this rule in China that a foreign auto company, in order to operate in China, has to have a joint venture with a Chinese auto company. And Volvo is foreign, which I'm sure Li Shufu was surprised because, well, he's Chinese and he owns Volvo. But when the NDRC says it's foreign, it's foreign. Volvo, the engineers and the headquarters for the company is still in Sweden. So, I mean, you could have argued about it, but once they say it, that's the way it is. So, all right, Volvo now has to have a joint venture partner. Well, guess who they partnered with? Geely. And so Geely is now going to get to benefit from all this intellectual property that Ford tried so hard to keep from falling into the hands of a Chinese auto company. So that's what's going on with Geely. And your third question, I'm sorry.
Infant industry protection.
Oh, another great question. The Japanese and the Koreans kept foreign automakers out when they started their auto industries. They put them on short-term contracts for licensing, so they got technology from them, but they made it really hard for foreign automakers to sell cars in China and in Japan and Korea, respectively. And to this day, almost no foreign cars are sold in Japan and Korea. They are very wed to their own homegrown brands. Protecting their infant industries was something smart that the Japanese and Korean governments did, because it gave their automakers time to build up the expertise and also to learn what it was that the Japanese and Korean consumers wanted in a car. So that by the time they lifted their tariffs, they didn't want foreign cars. China has approached it very differently. Back in the 1980s, they said, we need an auto industry. We don't really know how to build cars, so let's get the foreigners in. But they brought them in, they hooked them up on long-term contracts, 20-year contracts, that required technology transfer. But it was unspecified what that meant. They didn't say, we want you to give us your automatic transmission. We want you to teach us how to do this and this and this. Since it was left vague, the foreigners just came in and gave them last year's, 2 years, 3 years ago technology, and never really handed over their best stuff. And even today, the foreign automakers they're not bringing like their advanced lithium-ion batteries to China or their advanced hybrid systems, these sorts of things. They're keeping those out of China. But a big difference is we now have WTO. That's one. So China, as a member of WTO, had to lower its tariffs on imports from foreign countries. The second is Japan and Korea were Cold War allies of the United States and could kind of get away with that protectionist stuff. We would sort of look the other way. China is not fortunate enough to be in the position as an ally, and the Cold War is over anyway. So it's a difference in time, it's a difference in infrastructure, and it's a difference in China's policy in terms of how they dealt with it from the very start.
The WTO played a very important role. The WTO played a very important role in large part because for the United States, if China erected barriers, the United States would carry out punitive actions against Chinese goods. And remember, during the economic crisis, there's already pressure on the Chinese to reform their currency, open up their markets. So no, this was a trade war that no one wanted.
Even an uglier story, since these people are so nice. Once this became clear to the Europeans what was happening, my friends, the French, said, well, I see that Japan wishes to export cars to us, and we will sign an agreement, and the place where the cars can come in is Poitiers. And unfortunately, the Japanese at the time did not have a map. Poitiers is an inland city. It would mean you'd have to fly every Toyota made from Japan to France. So, no Toyotas came into the French market. C'est la vie. Now I want to tell you, before we go to wine and cheese and other things, that a lady who was here around 3 years ago, who is an artist at Pixar, was such a success, we're having her come back. She will be here on the 11th. Her name is Tia Crater. She's a fabulous creator of things like Nemo, if you remember the little fish who swam around in the waters off of Sydney, Australia, of Wally, the trash compactor that walked and talked, cleaning up the globe, and most interesting recently of a feminist icon, a little red-headed girl who goes off and does battle for good and fights evil. She's a very creative person. She brings all kinds of visual aids. We sit in the dark and we watch the Emeryville Giant, which is one of the great entertainment industries in the United States, come alive in front of you. Her card is out front. Please take one with you. Please come. You can see how it was. Tia Crater and others have made billions of dollars for Walt Disney Incorporated. And better than cars, we sell a lot of Walt Disney films around the Asia Pacific. But beyond that, we have the Indian Council General coming to tell us about incredible India. He's a fantastically interesting guy. He has been everywhere, done everything. He's been in Syria and in Pakistan as a diplomat. He's been in Britain as a diplomat. He was finally made an ambassador the first time to South Korea, where he wrote his first novel. He now has a second novel out. He's a true Renaissance man. Plays a wonderful game of golf. He's a fantastic bridge player. Just an amazing guy. And he's anxious to come and tell you all about India, incredible India. So he will be here. And then after that, we have just simply ransacked the market. We are going to bring you the head of the Federal Reserve. Not that guy you keep hearing about who runs in the White House every day and tells President Obama why things are going wrong, but the guy out here on the West Coast who's head of the Federal Reserve for the West Coast of the United States, Dr. Williams. Bright, charming, challenging guy. Will tell you where not to put your money, what money you might have left. We're also going to go off to war again in Afghanistan. The man who ran the war on the ground for President Bush and then decided that the real problem was that there was a crook. Remember crooks? A crook is president of Afghanistan by the name of Karzai. So he decided to leave the army with his 3 stars, and before he could get into retirement mode, Bush was gone and Obama was there, and Obama hired him to be his ambassador in Kabul. So he did the Kabul scene for a while until he was not happy at all with President Obama's surge in Afghanistan. So now what does he do for a living? He's down at Stanford as a scholar. Very intriguing guy, very frank. And he's going to come and tell you why you are in Afghanistan, the longest war in our history. And we're just going to go and tell you that once upon a time in American literature, there was a giant who wrote in the 19th century. He wrote about a fish. This huge white whale is coming ashore. It's beaching itself here in San Francisco. And it's been turned from being the greatest novel of the 19th century, Moby Dick by Melville, into a fantastically challenging opera. Been a huge success on its opening 5 years ago in Houston, and then in San Diego last year, and now it's coming to San Francisco Opera, and they're coming to us. So you can meet the great white whale and all those famous characters in that classic piece of literature. It's a wonderful company. They always bring us the best here. They obviously don't bring the entire company and all the sets. They bring commentary and excerpts, but we get a great singer, pianist, and you learn everything you ever wanted to know about Moby Dick. You don't have to go back and read 600 pages of an American classic. So you'll be invited to that also. We continue to fill up the calendar for you. Lots of exciting programs coming. We'd like to see you back, particularly when you come. You can tell us about whales in China, up into the North China Sea, and give us a look at that from your perspective. Anyway, now, would you join me in thanking our guests for being here tonight? Books are for sale outside, and there's wine, cheese, fruit. And then you can ask all your questions privately to Greg or to Charlotte. Thank you very much.